I'd like to discuss a common misconception, and that is the right brain, left brain model of brain function, which we now know is a metaphor taken literally too far. Now, in the original times, in the 1960s, 1970s, with the knowledge we had, it did seem to be this partition of functions, the logical linear functions on the left, the visual spatial functions on the right, and then of course the integration of those gives you higher level functions. But the brain at that time was literally, when they say left brain, they mean the left cerebral cortex. When they say right brain, the right cerebral cortex, because that was where it was conceived that these functions were largely done. We now know that not to be largely true. Indeed, there are logical, linear, sequential functions. There are visual, spatial, global, holistic functions. And they are indeed operated from the right cortex, right cerebral cortex, and left cerebral cortex. But they're not all there is. They are just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. Most of our brain function is totally subconscious. And so only the highest levels of processing actually become conscious, and then those are the ones we know and are familiar with. So it turns out that nothing is done any one place in the brain, rather it's done all over the brain. And so there are brainstem components, there are limbic components, and there are cortical components. The cortical components we're conscious of. And indeed, in my left cerebral cortex, that's what turns on when I am faced with a linear sequential problem. Mathematics is done there to a large extent. It needs some support from visual spatial processing, but it basically is done in that sequence and that side of the brain. The other side of the brain specializes in visual spatial relationships, visual spatial reasoning, and also holistic thinking. So, but now to understand these, they are only logical and visual spatial, or logic and gestalt, as they sometimes are called. Gestalt means the whole form. Okay, these thinkings are basically only activate a whole cascade of neurology. So while yes, logic is done here and visual spatial is done here, the actual processing encompasses the whole brain. There are components that are brainstem, there are components that are limbic, and then other conscious components that you have control over that are cortical. So I now call these logic and gestalt, or logic and visual spatial lead functions, because they initiate the action. And if it's not initiated, it doesn't happen. But once it is initiated, there's a cascade from the cortex all the way down through the brainstem and limbic areas, which can make their own unique contributions to either visual spatial or to linear sequential processing. So while it's a right brain it's on the right side, it's not the right brain because it's also below the level of the cortex, often bilateral. Both sides of the brain are at the brainstem level may be involved. Both sides of the brain at the limbic level may be involved. But once you go to the higher cortical regions, then it becomes asymmetrical. Then the process isn't done here. The processing is done there, quite literally. And it's initiated from that point. So that's what you have to understand, that right brain and left brain has been a useful model, but a somewhat inaccurate model in terms of the actual processing in the brain. And so, and little weight has been given to the subcortical, that means everything below the cortex, components of the brain. We understand that that is where a lot of the processing actually occurs. It's just out of our consciousness. So now when you hear right brain, left brain, think, okay, that means that it's a visual spatial function, it's a logical linear sequential function, and it's initiated here or it's initiated here. It's not done there. So this idea of right brain, left brain is a wonderful concept, and it's a great handle to understand brain function, that there are these two divisions, but you have to understand that it's not quite like it's said. It's not a brain, it's only the initiation. It's a cortical lead function that initiates a cascade of neurology that gives you the outcome. This is a brain. Well, no, it's not. It's a model of a brain. And this brain I can actually take apart. So you can now see I have a left brain and I have a right brain, right? But that's the outside. This is the cerebral cortex, the surface of the brain. It's only about 15 or 20 millimeters thick. And so the rest of the brain is on the inside. There's a lot of white matter tracts, And what you can see here in the left side, we just happen to have it highlighted, is a structure that's yellow, and it goes all the way around. This is part of the limbic system. It's deep inside the brain. Now, it's also on this side, but here it's not colored, it's just the white part. And so these colored parts are the cortical lobes. Frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. So these are what make up the brain. And of course, now we can see we have limbic system. This is brainstem. The structure here is the brainstem. So there's lots of processes done down here in the brainstem, done here in the limbic system. The higher level processing done up here in the neocortex. Neo means new cortex, because indeed evolutionarily it is the new cortex. Oops, and we have this gray thing down here. This is the cerebellum. And so I can take my cerebellum off, and you can see it looks kind of like another hemisphere, like a little brain. In fact, the name cerebellum means little brain. So these are the primary features, and this is involved. The cerebellum is involved in a lot of coordinating and making sure that intended action is the real action, and your intention and mentally is expressed also. So it's a very important structure that's kind of hidden away where you really can't see it, but yet is very important. In fact, the cerebellum, that part there, has 85% of all the neurons in the brain. Must be important. This has the other 15% because it's only a thin layer. Most of it is white matter that makes information flow from one place to the other in the brain. If things are done here, here, and here, you're going to need a lot of fibers connecting them. These are called integrative pathways or integration fibers. The biggest one you can see here is the corpus callosum. That is one massive structure of neurons that connect the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere and vice versa. So that structure, the corpus callosum, is about 200 to 800 million neurons. Now, it has quite a variation because it depends on your brain structure as to how many neurons you get. If you're a right-handed male, you only get 200. If you're a left-handed or non-right-handed female, you may get 800. And even some non-right-handed males have 800 million. So they have a different type of brain. We'll talk about that later.